The Anglo Saxon period, 400 to 1066. The context of this time period is that when the Romans left Britain in the 400s, they took with them their unified system of law. So what that means is in the early Anglo-Saxon period, there were multiple kingdoms, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia and Northumbria, as well as others, and multiple king's pieces. This leads to a disjointed system of law, which sometimes differed based on the area. Over the course of the Anglo-Saxon period, this would change. So, as you can see here on the timeline, the Anglo-Saxon period runs from the 400s up to 1066, ending with William of Normandy's conquest of England. So, to begin with, law and order in the Anglo-Saxon period is pretty brutal, and it's based around the idea of blood feuds, meaning almost literally an eye for an eye. If a family member was murdered, then the victim's family could take revenge against the perpetrator. Family is the law enforcement. The problem with this system is that it could lead to intergenerational lawful murder that could tear families apart over the course of a number of years. And that's the way it continues up until 663, where we have the Synod of Whitby. Hugely significant event, because this is when Anglo-Saxon kings convert to Christianity. What we'll see here then is the influence of the church beginning to increase. This influence means that there are attempts by kings to reduce blood feud violence by encouraging leniency in punishments. The reason for this is that it gives criminals or the perpetrators of crime the opportunity to repent and be rehabilitated. The church effectively does not believe in capital punishment. This, however, does remain the minority view for centuries. So whilst the church is advocating for more lenient approaches in punishment and the opportunity to rehabilitate, in reality, we don't see it come into play for another few centuries. What this also leads to is the introduction of trial by ordeal. These include trial by hot water, trial by fire, trial by cold water, all pretty brutal, in which you do something which would tear the flesh, and then after 3 days the bandages would be removed. If you'd healed, God had decided you were innocent. If you hadn't healed, God had decided you were guilty, and therefore you would then be punished. What's important to make clear here is the trial, whilst brutal, I won't go into the details on them because they're in front of you, but whilst the trials are brutal, they are not the punishment. Once you were found guilty, you would then be punished by fining or hanging, etc. The final trial by ordeal, which isn't there yet, is this one, trial by sacrament, and this is for the priests and the clergy members of the church, in which they have to eat a piece of bread without choking. And this would be used, as I say, for priests and members of the clergy accused of a crime, and realistically, they're not really going to choke. So that is just one example of how the church would often protect the guilty. The church influence, therefore, leads to more lenient punishments following the Synod of Whitby. For example, we now see the end of blood feuds and the introduction of botgeld, a fine for injury. The amount would change based on the body part injured, and the money was paid to the victim, just like the compensation system we have today. You also have weregeld, a fine payable for murder. The amount of compensation will change based on the social standing of the victim. Mutilations, as in, the chopping off of limbs or blinding people, became more common than the death penalty, as the church's influence suggested that this gave perpetrators of crime the opportunity to reform. You might be blind, but at least you can still get into heaven by doing good deeds for the rest of your life. Although less common than before, persistent criminals or repeat offenders were still hanged. This happened by being taken to the highest point in the 100 and then being hanged. The purpose of this is like a visual deterrent, sometimes hanged on the edges of the 100 as a symbolic gesture that criminals had ostracized themselves from the community, and shows the importance of community in law enforcement. How did they decide if you were guilty during the Anglo-Saxon period? Well, one method is trial by community, which took place in the 100 courts, in which the heads of tithings, groups of 10 men, were judges in the 100 courts. You also get shire courts, which would obviously have the shire reeves acting as the judges. In effect, we see the influence of the church again because people would swear oaths of their innocence. This is usually enough to resolve the issue, because it was believed that nobody would risk going to hell by lying. It'd be much better to face your punishment now, because if you lied under oath, you're going to hell, and that would be a much worse punishment. The reason that works at the time is because it's a highly religious society. Accused also had compurgators, oath helpers who would testify to the accused person's good character. Effectively, somebody knows you who says, I don't think they would commit this crime. If a decision could not be reached in this way, then you could use trial by ordeal. This took place in a church, not in a 100 court, because the decision was now being left up to God. Law enforcement throughout the Anglo Saxon period is reliant on community policing. The reason why it works in this way is because people still live in small villages where everybody knows everybody, and the idea is you all keep an eye on each other. The idea of collective responsibility. One way we see this is in the tithing. Once boys reached age 12, they joined a tithing. This was groups of 10 men responsible for each other's behaviour. If one of the 10 committed a crime, the other 9 were supposed to apprehend and catch the perpetrator. If they failed to do that, the other 9 in the tithing would face the punishment. This leads into the idea of collective responsibility, which enabled law enforcement through collective responsibility, everybody being responsible for the actions of others. We also get the hue and cry, the see and shout, as in, like, if you see a crime, you shout, stop thief, and everybody was supposed to chase the criminal. Not joining the hue and cry would be just as bad as committing the crime itself. And the problems with this system, though, is that it is limited. There is no visible presence of any sort of law enforcement to deter crime. And realistically, if you are not caught red-handed, really, you're going to get away with it probably.